I never expected that my decision to excavate a basement in December would turn into the most absurd neighborhood drama of my life, complete with a HOA president who called the authorities on what she deemed an eyesore, only to watch those same authorities use it as an impromptu winter wonderland for their kids. My name is Franklin Quincy, and I had been living in the Meadowbrook Hills subdivision in Grand Rapids, Michigan, for about 3 years when I decided it was finally time to add that extra living space I had always wanted. The house was perfect except for one thing. The basement was basically a glorified crawl space, barely 6 feet tall and mostly used for storage. I wanted a proper finished basement with enough height to actually feel comfortable, which meant digging down another 4 feet. The contractor I hired, a guy named Tommy who had done excellent work on my neighbor's garage, assured me it was doable and gave me a reasonable quote for the excavation work. The project started on December 3rd, right after Thanksgiving. Tommy and his crew showed up with a small excavator and began the process of digging out the dirt from beneath my house. The plan was to haul it away gradually, but Tommy mentioned that the disposal fees were going to add another few $1,000s to the project. Being somewhat budget conscious, I asked if there was any alternative. He suggested that since my property was just over half an acre with a good-sized backyard, I could keep the soil on site temporarily and either spread it around for landscaping in the spring or find someone who needed fill dirt. That sounded reasonable to me, so we agreed to pile the excavated soil in my backyard, away from the house and not blocking any sight lines. The pile grew steadily over the next week as they removed load after load of dark Michigan soil. By December 10th, when they finished the excavation phase, the pile was impressive. Roughly 15 feet tall, maybe 30 feet wide at the base, and shaped like a small hill in the back corner of my yard. It was not pretty, but it was winter. Everything was brown and dead anyway, and I figured nobody would care about a dirt pile that would be gone by spring. I was wrong about nobody caring. On December 12th, a Tuesday morning, I was working from home when my doorbell rang. I opened it to find a woman in her late 40s standing on my porch, wearing a puffy North Face jacket and holding a clipboard like it was a weapon. Her blonde hair was styled in that specific way that screamed, "I want to speak to the manager," and her expression suggested she had just discovered someone had parked in her favorite spot at Whole Foods. "Are you Franklin Quincy?" she asked, not bothering with pleasantries. "That's me." "Can I help you?" "I'm Patricia Hendricks, president of the Meadowbrook Hills HOA. I'm here about the unauthorized pile of dirt on your property." I blinked at her. "Unauthorized? It's my property. I'm doing renovations." Patricia's mouth tightened into a thin line. "According to the HOA covenants that you agreed to when you purchased your home, any significant alterations to the exterior appearance of your property require prior approval from the Architectural Review Committee. That includes large piles of debris." "It's not debris, it's soil from my basement excavation, and it's temporary." "Temporary or not, it's an eyesore and violates Section 7.3 of the Community Guidelines regarding property maintenance. You need to remove it immediately." I felt my patience already wearing thin. "Look, Patricia, it's December. The ground is freezing. I'm going to deal with it in the spring when I can actually do something with the soil. It's not hurting anyone. It's visible from the Hendersons' property, and they've complained. It's also potentially attracting rodents and creating drainage issues. It's dirt, in winter. What rodents and what drainage issues? Everything is frozen solid." Patricia clicked her pen, a sharp, aggressive sound. "Mr. Quincy, I'm trying to be reasonable here. The HOA board has discussed this, and we've decided that you have until December 20th to remove the pile, or will be forced to take further action. Further action meaning what? Fines, liens against your property, and possible legal action. We take our community standards very seriously. I could feel my blood pressure rising. You're threatening to fine me over dirt in my own backyard during winter. I'm enforcing the rules that everyone agreed to follow. You're not special, Mr. Quincy. She turned and walked away before I could respond, her boots crunching on the light dusting of snow that had fallen overnight. I closed the door and stood there for a moment, processing what had just happened. I had heard stories about HOA horror shows, but I had never experienced one personally. The Meadowbrook Hills HOA had been relatively quiet since I moved in, mostly just organizing the occasional neighborhood barbecue and making sure people did not paint their houses bizarre colors. This felt different. This felt personal. I called Tommy to ask about expediting the removal, but he explained that the disposal companies were backed up until after the holidays, and the cost would be nearly double if I wanted it done in the next week. I did not have an extra $3,000 lying around, especially not with the renovation already stretching my budget. I decided to fight it. Over the next few days, I researched the HOA covenants. The section Patricia had referenced did mention property maintenance and alterations, but the language was vague. It talked about permanent structures and neglected properties, but nothing specifically about temporary dirt piles from approved construction projects. I had pulled all the proper permits with the city for the basement work. Everything was legal and above board. I drafted a formal response to the HOA, citing the vague language and explaining that the pile would be removed in spring, which was a reasonable time frame for a temporary construction situation. I emailed my response to the HOA board on December 14th. Patricia replied within an hour, her email curt and dismissive. She stated that the board's interpretation of the covenants was final and that I should consult the community handbook, which apparently had more specific guidelines. I requested a copy of this handbook, which I had never received when I bought the house. She sent a PDF that looked like it had been scanned from a document created in 1987, complete with grainy text and crooked pages. Buried in Section 12 of this handbook was a provision that soil, gravel, or other earthen materials shall not be stored on properties for periods exceeding 30 days without express written permission from the Architectural Review Committee. The provision seemed designed for people who might dump a load of gravel for a project and then abandon it, not for someone actively working on a major renovation. Still, technically, she had me on a technicality. I requested a hearing with the Architectural Review Committee, which was my right according to the bylaws. Patricia scheduled it for December 18th at 7 in the evening at her house. I showed up with photos of the pile, my construction timeline, the disposal company's schedule, and a detailed explanation of why immediate removal was financially impractical and unnecessary. The committee consisted of Patricia, a retired accountant named Donald Morrison, and a younger guy named Brett Sullivan, who seemed like he just went along with whatever Patricia wanted. They sat across from me at Patricia's dining room table, and I presented my case calmly and thoroughly. Donald asked a few reasonable questions about the timeline. Brett said nothing. Patricia interrupted me multiple times to point out how the pile was ruining the aesthetic of the neighborhood. Patricia, it's winter. Nobody can even see most of the yards right now because of the snow and dead vegetation. By the time spring comes and people are actually outside enjoying their properties, the pile will be gone. That's beside the point, she insisted. We have standards. If we let you keep a pile of dirt for months, what's next? Someone else decides to store construction materials. Someone starts a compost pile. Where does it end? It ends with common sense, I replied, probably more sharply than I should have. This is a temporary situation related to permitted construction. I'm not running a junkyard. The committee deliberated for all of 5 minutes before Patricia announced that they were denying my request and upholding the December 20th deadline. I left feeling frustrated and backed into a corner. I could not afford the expedited removal, and spreading it around my frozen yard was impossible. That's when Patricia escalated things beyond reason. On December 19th, I got a call from the Grand Rapids Code Enforcement Office. A woman named Michelle informed me that they had received a complaint about a large pile of dirt on my property, and that they needed to send an inspector to verify whether it violated any city ordinances. Who filed the complaint? I asked, though I already knew. We can't disclose that information, but the complaint stated potential erosion issues and improper storage of excavated material. I agreed to meet the inspector the next day, December 20th, which was both the HOA's deadline and, ironically, the first day of winter break for the local schools. The inspector assigned to my case was a guy named Marcus Chen, and he called me that morning to confirm the appointment for 2 in the afternoon. Marcus showed up in a city truck right on time. He was in his mid-30s, wearing a heavy Carhartt jacket and carrying a tablet. What I did not expect was the 2 kids who climbed out of the truck with him. A boy who looked about 8 and a girl maybe 6, both bundled up in snow pants and winter coats. "Sorry about bringing the kids," Marcus said as he approached. "First day of winter break and my wife had a work emergency. I hope you don't mind. They'll stay in the truck." "No problem at all," I said, genuinely meaning it. The kids seemed excited, pointing at the pile of snow in my front yard from the plows. Marcus and I walked around to the backyard. The dirt pile stood there, now dusted with snow from the flurries we had gotten overnight. It looked almost picturesque, like a small hill in a winter landscape. Marcus took photos and measurements, asked about the excavation permit, and inspected the area around the pile for any signs of erosion or runoff issues. "So, what's the verdict?" I asked after he had done his assessment. Marcus looked up from his tablet. "Honestly, there's no violation here. You have a valid excavation permit. The pile is on your property. It's not blocking any right-of-way or creating any drainage problems. And there's no ordinance against temporary storage of soil during active construction." Whoever filed the complaint was probably just upset about the aesthetics, which isn't a code enforcement issue. Relief washed over me. "Can you put that in writing?" "Absolutely. I'll file my report today. You should receive a formal letter within a week stating that no violation was found." He paused, glancing back at the pile. "Between you and me, that's one impressive pile. How much did you excavate?" "About 40 cubic yards. I'm adding height to my basement." "Nice. And honestly, this dirt could be worse places. It's actually pretty well contained." He looked thoughtful for a moment. "You know, my kids have been driving me crazy about finding a good sledding hill. The parks around here are so crowded and the hills are not that great. That pile would be perfect," I laughed. "You're welcome to it. Seriously. If they want to sled on it, go for it." Marcus's face lit up. "Really? You wouldn't mind?" "Not at all. Better someone gets some use out of it." Marcus walked back to the truck and talked to his kids. I could see their faces go from bored to ecstatic. They grabbed sleds from the back of the truck, these plastic disc-style sleds in bright colors, and came running toward the backyard. Marcus helped them climb to the top of the pile, which had just enough slope and height to make for a fun ride. The snow on top was a little thin but slick enough that the sleds moved. For the next 30 minutes, I stood in my backyard watching a code enforcement inspector, and his 2 kids have the time of their lives sledding down my dirt pile. The boy, whose name was Luke, quickly figured out the fastest path down. The girl, Emma, was more cautious but giggled uncontrollably every time she slid down. Marcus took a few runs himself, his professional demeanor completely abandoned in favor of pure dad mode fun. "This is amazing," Luke shouted after one particularly fast run. "Dad, can we come back tomorrow?" "We'll see, buddy. We have to ask Mr. Quincy if he's okay with that." "Anytime," I said. "The pile is not going anywhere until spring." Marcus thanked me profusely, and as they were packing up to leave, I had an idea. "Hey, Marcus, would you mind if I took a photo? I want to document the inspector's official approval of my pile," he laughed. "Sure, but maybe not with me sledding on it. That might not look great for the city." I took a photo of Marcus standing next to the pile with his tablet, giving a thumbs up. It was perfect. After they left, I immediately wrote an email to Patricia and the HOA board. I attached Marcus's initial verbal assessment and the photo, explaining that the city code enforcement had inspected the pile and found no violations. I stated that I would be keeping the pile until spring as originally planned, and that any further harassment would be considered a violation of my rights as a homeowner. Patricia's response came within 20 minutes, and it was exactly as unhinged as I expected. She claimed that the HOA covenants superseded city ordinances for aesthetic matters, and that they would be proceeding with fines starting December 21st. The fine schedule was aggressive, $100 per day until the pile was removed. I consulted with a lawyer friend of mine named Greg, who specialized in property law. He looked over the HOA covenants, the handbook, and Patricia's emails. His assessment was straightforward. The HOA was overreaching, and their fine schedule was likely unenforceable given that I was in active compliance with all city regulations, and the pile was temporary. He offered to write a cease and desist letter for a small fee, which I gladly accepted. The letter went out on December 22nd, detailing why the HOA's actions were inappropriate and threatening legal action if they proceeded with fines. It also pointed out that Patricia's decision to call code enforcement could be considered harassment, and that the HOA president had a duty to act in the best interest of all homeowners, not just those who shared her aesthetic preferences. Christmas came and went. The pile remained, now fully covered in snow and looking like a natural part of the winter landscape. Marcus brought his kids back twice more to Sled, and word spread in the neighborhood. A few other families asked if their kids could use the hill, and I said yes. By New Year's, my backyard had become the unofficial neighborhood sledding spot. Kids were having a blast, parents were grateful for a safe place close to home, and the pile was serving a purpose beyond just sitting there. Patricia was furious. She sent another email on January 3rd, stating that I was now running an unauthorized recreational facility and creating liability issues for the neighborhood. She threatened to call the city again and also to contact my homeowner's insurance company. That's when things got really interesting. One of the parents who had been bringing his kids to Sled, a lawyer named Scott Hendricks, who ironically was Patricia's husband, approached me one evening. He looked embarrassed. "Franklin, I want to apologize for my wife," Scott said. "She's taken this way too far, and I've told her as much. This whole thing is ridiculous." "Does she know you've been bringing your kids here to Sled?" I asked. He winced. "No, and I'd appreciate it if we could keep it that way for now, but I wanted you to know that not everyone on the board agrees with her. Donald thinks she's being unreasonable too, but he does not want to start a fight. Brett just does whatever Patricia says because she helped his mom when she was sick a few years ago. So what do I do? She's threatening fines and more complaints. Scott sighed. Honestly, I think she's bluffing about the fines because she knows they're not enforceable. But she's stubborn. She does not like being told she's wrong. If you want this to end, you might need to go over her head. How do I do that? Request a special meeting of the full HOA membership. If enough homeowners show up and vote against her position, she has to back down. It's in the bylaws. I thanked Scott for the advice and started gathering support. I went door to door in the neighborhood, explaining the situation to anyone who would listen. Most people were sympathetic. Several mentioned that they had their own run-ins with Patricia over minor issues: mailbox colors, lawn ornaments, the height of bushes. A pattern emerged of a HOA president who cared more about control than community. I drafted a petition requesting a special meeting and got 43 signatures out of the 72 homes in the subdivision. That was more than the required 25% threshold. I submitted it on January 8th, and the meeting was scheduled for January 15th at the community center. The week leading up to the meeting, Patricia went into overdrive. She sent out a neighborhood-wide email painting me as a troublemaker who was trying to undermine the HOA and destroy property values. She claimed that the dirt pile was an environmental hazard and that allowing it to remain would set a dangerous precedent. She even suggested that I was profiting from the sledding by charging admission, which was completely false. Several people forwarded me her emails, and I responded with a calm, factual message explaining the situation, including the code enforcement approval and the timeline for removal. I also mentioned that the sledding had been free and had brought the community together during the holidays. The night of January 15th was cold, with temperatures in the teens, but the community center was packed. Nearly 60 households sent representatives. Patricia stood at the front with her laptop and a projector, ready to make her case. I sat in the back, nervous but prepared. Patricia went first, delivering a 15-minute presentation about property values, community standards, and the slippery slope of allowing violations. She showed photos of the pile from various angles, all taken before the snow had covered it, making it look as ugly as possible. She brought up the 30-day rule and argued that I was willfully violating established guidelines. When it was my turn, I kept it simple. I showed the excavation permit, the code enforcement report with Marcus's approval, the timeline for removal, and photos of kids sledding on the pile. I explained the costs of immediate removal versus spring removal, and pointed out that the pile had actually become a community asset over the past few weeks. This is not about defying the HOA, I said. This is about common sense. I followed all city regulations. I'm doing a legal renovation. The pile is temporary. It's not causing any harm, and it's actually brought neighbors together. Patricia has turned this into a crusade that's wasting everyone's time and energy. The discussion that followed was heated. A few people sided with Patricia, mostly her close friends. But the majority were either supportive of me or just tired of the drama. Scott, to his credit, abstained from commenting, probably to avoid the marital consequences. When it came time to vote, the question was whether the HOA should drop its enforcement action against me and allow the pile to remain until May 1st, which was a reasonable spring deadline. The vote was 41 in favor, 12 against, and 7 abstentions. It was not even close. Patricia looked like she had been slapped. She tried to argue that the vote was procedurally flawed, but Donald, the accountant, pointed out that everything had been done by the book. She gathered her things and left without another word. I thought that would be the end of it, but Patricia had one more card to play. On January 20th, I received a certified letter from a law firm representing the HOA. It was a formal demand letter, claiming that I owed over $3,000 in fines for the period from December 21st to January 15th, despite the vote to drop enforcement. The letter argued that the fines had been properly assessed before the vote and were therefore still valid. I immediately forwarded it to Greg, my lawyer friend. He was incredulous. "This is absurd. They can't retroactively fine you after the membership voted against enforcement. This is Patricia acting on her own, not on behalf of the HOA. What do I do?" We respond with our own letter, and we make it clear that if they pursue this, we'll countersue for harassment and seek attorney's fees. I doubt the HOA's lawyer even knows the full story. Greg drafted a response that was polite but firm, laying out the facts and the membership vote. He sent it not just to the law firm, but also to the entire HOA board, with a note that any further action without board approval could expose individual board members to personal liability. That got their attention. Donald called me the next day, apologizing profusely. He explained that Patricia had sent the demand letter without consulting the rest of the board, and that they were not pursuing the fines. He also mentioned that several board members were considering asking for Patricia's resignation. Patricia resigned as HOA president on February 1st. She sent a terse email to the neighborhood stating that she was stepping down due to personal reasons, and that the board would elect a new president at their next meeting. Scott was noticeably absent from the house for a few days after that, and neighborhood gossip suggested that the marriage was under serious strain. Donald was elected the new HOA president in a unanimous vote. One of his first acts was to send me a formal apology on behalf of the HOA and to clarify that the dirt pile was approved to remain until May 1st. He also suggested creating clearer guidelines for temporary construction situations to avoid similar conflicts in the future. The winter continued, and the sledding hill remained popular. Marcus and his kids came back several more times, and we became friendly. He told me that his supervisor had gotten a kick out of the whole story, and that the photo of him giving the thumbs up had made it onto the office bulletin board with the caption, "Code Enforcement Approved." In late February, we got a massive snowstorm that dumped 18 inches of snow on Grand Rapids. The pile became even better for sledding, with a thick layer of snow creating a fast, smooth surface. The neighborhood kids were out there every day after school, and I started keeping a thermos of hot chocolate on hand for anyone who wanted to warm up. One afternoon, I was watching from my back porch when I noticed an older woman standing at the edge of my yard, watching the kids sled. I did not recognize her at first, but then she turned and I realized it was Margaret Henderson, whose property supposedly had the view of my pile that Patricia had complained about. I walked over to her. "Mrs. Henderson, I'm Franklin. I want to apologize if the pile has been an eyesore for you. I know Patricia mentioned that you had complained." Margaret looked surprised. "Complained? I never complained about anything. Patricia came to me in December and asked if the pile bothered me, and I told her I had not even noticed it. She said she was going to handle it anyway." I had no idea she was causing all this trouble. I felt a surge of anger but kept my voice calm. "So you never filed a complaint with the HOA?" "Absolutely not. I think this whole thing has been wonderful. My grandson came to visit last week, and he had the best time sledding on that hill. You've done more for this neighborhood than Patricia ever did with her rules and complaints." That conversation confirmed what I had suspected all along. Patricia had manufactured the complaint to justify her crusade. She had used Mrs. Henderson's name without permission, which was not only unethical but potentially actionable. I mentioned it to Donald, and he was horrified. He reached out to Mrs. Henderson, who confirmed the story. The HOA board issued another formal apology, this time specifically addressing Patricia's misrepresentation. They also amended the community guidelines to require documented complaints before enforcement actions could be taken, which seemed like it should have been standard procedure all along. March arrived, and with it the first signs of spring. The snow began to melt, and the dirt pile slowly emerged from its white covering. I contacted 3 different landscaping companies to get quotes for spreading the soil around my property. One of them offered to take half of it for free, because they were working on a project that needed fill dirt, which would save me money. The sledding season officially ended in mid-March when the snow was too thin to be safe. I put up a handmade sign thanking everyone for a great winter and announcing that the hill would be coming down in April. Several parents brought their kids by to take final runs on the few remaining patches of snow, and one family even brought me a thank you card signed by all their kids. The dirt removal happened over 2 days in mid-April. Half of it went to the landscaping company's project, and the other half was spread around my property, filling in some low spots and creating gentle slopes that would help with drainage. By April 20th, the pile was completely gone, and my yard looked better than it had before the excavation. My basement renovation was finished in early May. The extra height made an incredible difference, and I ended up with a beautiful finished space that included a home office, a workout area, and a guest bedroom. The whole project had taken longer and been more stressful than I anticipated, but the result was worth it. The real surprise came in June. The neighborhood held its annual summer barbecue, and the turnout was bigger than it had been in years. Donald gave a short speech about community and working together, and several people came up to me to say that the whole dirt pile saga had actually brought the neighborhood closer. People who had never talked before had met while their kids were sledding. New friendships had formed. The community felt more like a community. Marcus and his family showed up at the barbecue too, which surprised me since they did not live in the subdivision. Marcus explained that his wife had wanted to meet the guy who had let them sled all winter, and his kids had wanted to see where the hill used to be. Luke and Emma ran around my backyard, marveling at how flat it was now. "I still can't believe you let us sled on your dirt pile," Marcus said, shaking his head with a grin. "My kids still talk about it. Best winter break ever." "I can't believe the HOA president called code enforcement on dirt," I replied, "but I'm glad something good came out of it." Scott Hendricks approached me later in the evening, looking more relaxed than I had seen him in months. "I wanted to give you an update. Patricia and I are officially separated. The divorce should be final by the end of summer." "I'm sorry to hear that." "Don't be. It was a long time coming." The whole dirt pile thing was just the final straw. I realized I had been making excuses for her controlling behavior for years. When I saw how happy our kids were sledding in your backyard, and then found out she had been lying about Mrs. Henderson's complaint, I knew I could not do it anymore. "How are your kids handling it?" "Better than I expected. They miss the hill though," he laughed. "They asked if you're planning any more excavation projects." The summer passed peacefully. The new HOA board was functional and reasonable, focusing on actual community needs rather than petty enforcement. They organized neighborhood cleanups, improved the common areas, and created a community garden that several residents contributed to. In August, I got an unexpected call from a local news reporter who had heard about the story from someone in the neighborhood. She wanted to do a human interest piece about the HOA conflict and how it had resolved. I was hesitant at first, but after talking with Donald and getting his blessing, I agreed. The story ran in early September with the headline "Dirt Pile Drama Turns into Community Victory." It featured interviews with me, Marcus, several parents whose kids had used the sledding hill, and Donald. The reporter had even tracked down Margaret Henderson, who gave a quote about how the experience had taught her the importance of speaking up when someone misrepresents you. Patricia was mentioned in the article, but had declined to comment. According to neighborhood gossip, she had moved to a different suburb and was now dealing with her own HOA issues at her new condo, which felt like poetic justice. The article went semi-viral in local circles, getting shared widely on social media. I received messages from people all over Michigan and even a few from other states, sharing their own HOA horror stories. Many thanked me for standing up to unreasonable enforcement and for finding a creative solution that benefited everyone. One message particularly stood out. It was from a woman named Carol Jenkins in Ann Arbor, who was dealing with her own HOA dispute over a vegetable garden they claimed was not aesthetically appropriate. She had read the article and felt inspired to fight back. She asked for advice, and I spent an hour on the phone with her, sharing what I had learned about HOA bylaws, membership votes, and the importance of building community support. Carol ended up winning her fight too, and her HOA amended their rules to explicitly allow vegetable gardens. She sent me a photo of her thriving tomato plants with a note that said, "Sometimes all it takes is one person willing to stand up for common sense." As fall arrived and the leaves began to change, I found myself reflecting on the entire experience. What had started as a simple home renovation and turned into a nightmare of bureaucratic overreach had ultimately become something positive. The neighborhood was stronger, the HOA was functioning better, and I had made genuine friendships with people I might never have talked to otherwise. Marcus continued to stay in touch, and we grabbed lunch occasionally. He told me that the dirt pile story had become legendary in the code enforcement office, and that new inspectors were told about it during training as an example of creative problem solving and good community relations. In October, the HOA held its annual meeting to elect board members and discuss the upcoming year. The attendance was triple what it had been the previous year, a direct result of people realizing that participation mattered. Donald was re-elected as president, and 2 new board members were added who were specifically committed to transparent, reasonable governance. During the meeting, someone proposed creating an official community sledding hill on one of the common areas for the next winter. The idea was enthusiastically supported, and they allocated budget to have a proper hill constructed with safe slopes and good drainage. They even mentioned that it would be called Franklin's Hill, as a tribute to the dirt pile that had started it all. I objected to the name, feeling like it was too much, but I was outvoted. The hill was built in November, and when the first snow fell in early December, it was packed with kids. Marcus brought Luke and Emma for the inaugural sledding session, and they declared it almost as good as the original dirt pile, which I took as high praise. The anniversary of the whole saga came and went. December 20th, 1 year after Marcus had first inspected my pile, I hosted a small gathering at my house for the people who had been most involved in the situation. Marcus and his family came, along with Scott and his kids, Margaret Henderson, Donald, and several other neighbors who had supported me during the fight. We stood in my backyard, now perfectly landscaped with the soil that had caused so much controversy, and toasted to common sense, community, and the absurdity of HOA politics. Luke asked if I was planning to dig another basement, and everyone laughed. "No more excavation projects," I promised. "But if I ever do need to move dirt again, you'll be the first to know." The gathering was warm and full of laughter, a stark contrast to the tension and frustration of the previous winter. As people left, many of them hugged me and thanked me not just for the sledding hill, but for standing up to unreasonable authority and showing that ordinary homeowners could push back against overreach. In the months that followed, the story continued to have ripples. The Grand Rapids City Council, inspired by the publicity, reviewed their code enforcement procedures and created clearer guidelines for how complaints should be handled and what constituted actual violations versus aesthetic disagreements. They specifically noted that inspectors should focus on safety and compliance with actual ordinances, not personal preferences or HOA disputes. The Michigan HOA Reform Coalition, a statewide advocacy group, reached out to me to speak at one of their events. I shared my experience with an audience of about 200 homeowners, many of whom were dealing with their own HOA conflicts. The main message I tried to convey was the importance of knowing your rights, building community support, and not being intimidated by threats that had no legal basis. Several attendees approached me afterward with tears in their eyes, telling me about years of harassment from their HOAs over minor issues. One elderly man had been fined repeatedly for the color of his mailbox, which was a shade of brown that the HOA claimed was not approved, even though it had been installed by the original builder. A young couple had been threatened with liens because their children's playset was allegedly too tall, despite being well within city regulations. These stories reinforced my belief that HOA reform was desperately needed, and that too many boards were run by people like Patricia, who cared more about control than community. I started writing letters to state legislators, advocating for laws that would limit HOA overreach and provide homeowners with better recourse when boards acted unreasonably. By the time spring arrived again, I had become an unlikely advocate for HOA reform. I testified before a state legislative committee considering new HOA regulations, sharing my dirt pile story as an example of how vague covenants and unchecked board power could create absurd situations. The committee was receptive, and several members mentioned that they had received similar complaints from constituents. The proposed legislation included provisions requiring HOAs to clearly document complaints, limiting fines for first-time violations of subjective aesthetic rules, and making it easier for homeowners to challenge board decisions. It was not perfect, but it was progress. The bill passed in the State House and was moving through the Senate as of May. My basement, the catalyst for everything, had become my favorite part of the house. I spent my evenings in the home office, working on advocacy materials and connecting with other homeowners who were fighting similar battles. The space that had been a cramped crawl space was now bright, comfortable, and functional, exactly what I had envisioned. In June, I received an unexpected package in the mail. It was from Patricia, forwarded through the HOA with no return address. Inside was a handwritten note on expensive stationery. The message was brief. "I may have overreacted. The neighborhood looks happy. I hope your basement turned out well." It was not quite an apology, but it was an acknowledgement which felt like more than I had expected. I showed it to Scott the next time I saw him, and he was surprised. He mentioned that Patricia had been going to therapy as part of the divorce process and was apparently working on understanding why she had such a need for control. "She's not a monster," Scott said. "She just got so caught up in being the enforcer that she forgot what the HOA was supposed to be about. I think losing the presidency and the marriage made her reevaluate things." I appreciated Scott's perspective, and I found myself hoping that Patricia would find peace, even if I never wanted to deal with her again. People were complicated, and while her actions had been wrong, I could understand how someone might get trapped in a mindset of rigid rule enforcement, especially if they genuinely believed they were protecting the community. The second summer in my renovated house was blissful. I hosted regular barbecues in my newly landscaped backyard, the soil from the infamous pile having created beautiful, gentle slopes that were perfect for outdoor seating. The grass had grown in thick and green, and I had planted native wildflowers along the back fence that attracted butterflies and bees. Marcus and his family came to several of the barbecues, and Luke and Emma had become fixtures in the neighborhood, often playing with Scott's kids and other children from surrounding houses. The community that had formed around the dirt pile had solidified into genuine friendships that extended beyond the initial shared experience. In August, I got a call from a producer at a regional public radio station. They were doing a series on local government and community organizations, and they wanted to feature the dirt pile story as an example of grassroots advocacy and community organizing. I agreed to an interview, which aired in September and reached an even wider audience than the newspaper article had. The response was overwhelming. I received emails and calls from people across Michigan and neighboring states, all sharing their own stories of HOA overreach. Many asked for advice, and I found myself spending hours each week on the phone or writing emails, helping people understand their rights and strategize their responses to unreasonable enforcement actions. It occurred to me that there was a real need for organized advocacy and education in this area. I started working with the Michigan HOA Reform Coalition to create a resource guide for homeowners, covering topics like understanding covenants, challenging board decisions, and when to seek legal help. The guide was published online and in print, distributed free through libraries and community centers across the state. As fall arrived again, bringing with it the beautiful Michigan colors of red, orange, and gold, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for how everything had turned out. What could have been just a frustrating fight with a petty HOA president had become an opportunity to make a real difference in how communities were governed and how homeowners were treated. The sledding hill on the common area was prepared for another winter season, and excitement was building among the neighborhood kids. Plans were made for a lighting system so that sledding could happen safely in the evenings, and someone had donated funds for a warming shelter with hot chocolate and benches. In November, the Michigan legislature passed the HOA reform bill, and the governor signed it into law. The new regulations would take effect in January, giving homeowners across the state better protections against overreach and more transparent processes for challenging decisions. Several legislators specifically mentioned my testimony and the dirt pile story as examples of why the reform was needed. I was invited to the bill signing ceremony, which felt surreal. Standing in the state capitol, watching the governor sign legislation that would help thousands of homeowners, I thought about that December morning when Patricia had showed up at my door, clipboard in hand, ready to enforce rules that barely made sense. If someone had told me then that it would lead to statewide reform, I would never have believed them. The ceremony was covered by local media, and the dirt pile story was mentioned again, now with the context of legislative change. Marcus texted me a photo of the news segment with the message, "From sledding hill to state law. Not bad." December arrived, bringing with it snow and the one-year anniversary of Marcus's inspection. I decided to host an anniversary party, inviting everyone who had been part of the journey. The turnout was huge, with over 50 people cramming into my house and spilling out into the heated garage. Marcus and his family came, along with Scott, Donald, Margaret Henderson, Carol Jenkins from Ann Arbor who had won her garden fight, and dozens of neighbors. We told stories, laughed about the absurdity of the whole situation, and celebrated the community that had formed. Luke and Emma gave a dramatic reenactment of their first sledding experience, complete with exaggerated wipeouts and sound effects. Scott shared that his divorce had been finalized and that he was dating someone new, someone who thought the whole dirt pile story was hilarious. Donald gave a short speech about how the neighborhood had changed over the past year, becoming more connected and engaged. He announced that HOA membership participation was at an all-time high, and that the board was working on several new community initiatives, all based on feedback from residents rather than top-down enforcement. As the evening wound down and people began to leave, Marcus pulled me aside. "I've been thinking about that day I came to inspect your pile. I was just doing my job, you know. But seeing how it all turned out, how something that could have been just another complaint became this whole movement, it reminded me why I got into code enforcement in the first place." "Why's that?" I asked. "Because I wanted to help people, not punish them. I wanted to make sure buildings were safe and communities were healthy, not enforce arbitrary rules. Your pile was safe. It wasn't hurting anyone. And when I approved it, I was just following the actual regulations, not someone's personal preferences. But the fact that it became something positive, something that brought people together, that's what it's all about." We shook hands, and I watched as he loaded his sleepy kids into his truck. Emma waved through the window, and I waved back, thinking about how a simple act of letting them sled had been the beginning of something much larger. The winter passed with regular sledding sessions on Franklin's Hill, as it had officially been named despite my protests. The neighborhood kids took ownership of it, organizing informal races and building jumps on the sides. Parents gathered around fire pits that the HOA had installed, creating a genuine community gathering space that was used almost daily when snow conditions were good. In February, I received notification that I had been nominated for a Community Service Award from the city of Grand Rapids. The nomination cited my advocacy for homeowner rights and my role in bringing the neighborhood together. The award ceremony was in March, and I was genuinely surprised to win, receiving a plaque and a handshake from the mayor. The local news covered the ceremony, and the reporter who had originally written about the dirt pile did a follow-up story, tracking the journey from conflict to advocacy to recognition. The story included updated interviews with Marcus, Donald, and several neighbors, all talking about how the community had grown stronger. Spring arrived, and with it came the anniversary of the dirt pile's removal. I planted a tree in the spot where the pile had been, a white oak that would grow tall and provide shade for decades. Several neighbors came to the planting, and we took photos to mark the occasion. As I stood in my backyard, looking at the small tree and the beautifully landscaped yard that had been shaped by the soil from my basement, I reflected on everything that had happened. A pile of dirt had become a sledding hill. A HOA dispute had become a community movement. A code enforcement inspection had become a friendship. And a frustrating fight with an overzealous HOA president had led to statewide reform that would protect thousands of homeowners. The experience had taught me that standing up for common sense mattered, that communities were stronger when people engaged rather than complied blindly, and that sometimes the most absurd situations could lead to the most meaningful changes. My basement renovation was complete, my yard was beautiful, my neighborhood was thriving, and I had found a purpose in advocacy that I had never expected. As summer approached, bringing longer days and warmer weather, I looked forward to another season of backyard barbecues, neighborhood gatherings, and continuing the work of HOA reform. The dirt pile was long gone, but its legacy remained in the friendships formed, the laws changed, and the community strengthened. And every time I saw kids playing on Franklin's Hill, or received a message from someone I had helped with their HOA dispute, I was reminded that sometimes the best responses to unreasonable authority are creativity, community, and a willingness to let code enforcement inspectors bring their kids to sled on your approved pile of dirt.